Hi, everyone. My name is Cyrielle Filias. I'm the lead program learning and development at CEREC. And on behalf of all the CEREC team, welcome to today's webinar. Good evening here in North America. Good morning in Pacific. We're very happy to have you all with us. And today we are actually delighted to start a new webinar series done in partnership with the Career Development Association of New Zealand called Global Perspective in Career Development, Empowering Your Inclusive Practice through Indigenous Knowledge and Worldviews. And for this series, we are delighted to be with a group of inspiring career professionals from New Zealand and Canada, who will be with us over the next 2 weeks to share their journey in career development field and their perspective on the cultural approaches to Indigenous career development. Thank you to all of them to be with us today. And to moderate those, I'm sure, captivating conversation, we are very grateful and honored to be joined by Victoria Grand, Chair of the Counseling Foundation of Canada. But before starting, I want to pay my respect to the original peoples of the territory upon which I physically sit here in the CEREC office in Toronto. For dozens of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga Anishinaabe of New Credit. And I recognize that Indigenous people are the original stewards and caretaker of these lands and water, and that today this meeting place still serves as the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And as a call to action for supporting reconciliation through learning and sharing, I would like to share an interesting resources, not only to learn more about the traditional lands of what we now call Canada, but also about traditional lands across the world, including in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the tool is called Native Land, and I will share the link in the chat shortly, because it's an app launched by Native Land Digital, a Canadian non-for-profit organization, and it's basically an animated maps of the world that allow you to quickly identify Indigenous nations, territory, and community walkways. But what I found very interesting is that they also share a wide range of resources for individuals or organizations. So I will post the link in the chat shortly, and I will invite you to explore and learn more about all the traditional lands that exist around the world. I will also like to take a few moments to introduce you to CEREC and share some housekeeping notes with you all. So CEREC is a charitable organization that focuses on education and research in career counseling and career development in Canada. And we found projects that create new knowledge and develop innovative resources. We have 3 main programs: the Canexus National Career Development Conference, the careerwise.ca website, which features the top news and view in the field with a French version called orientation.ca, and the Canadian Journal of Career Development, which is free to access. Of course, we also delivered learning through these, for example, through this webinar series. So you can learn more about all of work and CEREC resources by visiting our website at cerec.ca. And you can also see a little icon of the survey, because we are always looking at new webinar and learning opportunity for you. So you will have a survey at the very end of the series where you will be able to share your learning need for 2024 and beyond. And we will try to address them as well. So thank you in advance for your answer. Now, just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. So you can interact with our group of panelists and ask your question or share comments at any time by using the question function you see on your screen. We will have a dedicated a section for Q&A at the end of today's webinar, where our presenter will welcome your question. And please note also that we will send you the recording of today's webinar within the next 24 hours. Now, and before passing it over to our moderator, Victoria Grand, I would like to thank the Career Development Association of New Zealand for partnering with us on this amazing series. It has really been an honor to work with this wonderful team across the world, and I'm so thrilled to be joined by Serena Tiati, the Vice President of CDNZ, to say a few words about the organization. So please, over to you, Serena.
Ena mana, ena reo, ena hoe whā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Nō kuki ai rani o kutupuna, I whānau mai au I Aotearoa. Kei tamaki makaurau taku kāinga e nāia nei. Kei te mahi au ki Waipapa Taumatarau. Ko au, te tūmua ke tuarua o Sedans. Ko Serena Tiaiti, tōku ingoa. Tihe mauri ora. Kia ora whānau. My name is Serena Tiaiti and I'm the Vice President for the Career Development Association of New Zealand, which I will refer to as Sedans. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude to CERIC for the opportunity to extend a mihi to you all and to share my pepeha. For our international guests, a pepeha is a significant tradition in Te Ao Māori, which allows us to connect with one another. The Māori people are the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Next slide, please. Today it is with great privilege that I introduce Sedans to our global audience. Sedans serves as the National Professional Association for Career Development Experts in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Within our Sedans community, we are a diverse group of 400 plus members led by a voluntary National Executive Committee. Our overarching vision is to champion and lead the advancement of career development in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We also acknowledge our responsibility as a partner organisation committed to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, ensuring that our association stands firmly upon 4 pillars: advocacy, professionalism, sustainability, and collaboration. Allow me to add that we embrace the wisdom of a Māori whakatauki, a proverb, ka mua ka muri, which translates to moving forward by looking back, or as we've termed it here, walking backwards into the future. We recognise the significance of learning from our past experiences to shape our future. This proverb emphasises the pivotal role our history plays in guiding our future direction and decision-making. Before I end, I'm going to shamelessly promote our international conference next month. Sedans is hosting the event from the 11th to the 13th of October in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. If you're seeking an authentic Aotearoa experience, this event is not to be missed. In closing, I wish to acknowledge CERIC again for initiating and creating this platform for an Indigenous webinar. We take pride in having speakers from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Dr. Lynette Reid and Peter Pulu, who will generously share their profound cultural knowledge and experiences in this space. Again, thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself and Sedans. E mihi ana ki a koutou. I'll hand it over to Victoria.
Thank you, Serena. So I'm the moderator, and I'm going to ask each of my panelists first to introduce themselves, and then I will speak following them. So I'm going to start with Lynette.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hui whā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ki te tangata kua hui nei ngā mihi. E whānau, ngā hapu, e te iwi, nui tonu te mihi ki a koutou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ko poke hapoko te maunga, ko waimoko te awa, ko Ngāti Kanohi te iwi, ko whitireia te wharenui, ko whangara mai tāwhiti te marae, ko Reid te purei, te whānau, ko Lynette Reid aho. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Good morning from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Lynette Reid, and I'd like to introduce myself further by sharing some illustrations relevant to my perspective today. I am Māori, and my whānau are from a small place on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. All of the pictures on this slide represent a significant part of my contribution for today. All speak to the struggles and resistance to colonisation and have shaped my career practice, research and teaching. I hope you enjoy the session today. Mauri ora.
Thank you, Lynette. Peter.
Alofa lava, mano lava le soifo mau malelangi mama. E mo lava na CV inga whaftai lo tātua li e mo whai an tātua whaatasi le nei taimi. tātou te tangata no mawhitūtū nā e mo le nei mata opu tā ua. Tēnā koutou katoa, e whānau mai au te taha o te awa o tāmaki, e raro te maru o te maunga o te poki o tara, e huri au no Hāmoa, kei te noho au kei Manurewa, ko pita puru tuku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to take this opportunity and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our Indigenous host. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and all elders of our Indigenous communities worldwide who may be here today. So warm Pacific greetings to you all from the sunny shores of Aotearoa, Mānofa. Yes, it's really great to be here. For me, as a practitioner, I operate from a place from my Indigenous Pacific upbringing. I am Samoan by birth, Samoan by ethnicity, but I was born and raised in New Zealand. Both parents are Samoans. And these are the three fundamentals that have been brought up with an importance or the pillars within Pacific communities, and that's a sense of collectivism, spirituality, and indigeneity. Whaftai te lirawa. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Peter. Trina.
Ani Buju. My name is Trina Maher, and I come to you today from Southern Ontario, Canada, a place known as the Three Fires Confederacy, just north of Toronto. Where I originally come from is Northern Ontario, and that's what you see, the picture of the beautiful lake at sunset. It's a place where my mother's ancestors used to travel from and stop there for a natural meeting place, and they called that place Wasakwagama. It means the place where the trees shine on the water, because we have lots of those beautiful birch trees. Later in time, it became known as Shining Tree, a little village, which is about an hour away from my mom's community of Matagami First Nation. And the other two photos that you see here, one is me and my mom, and the other one is my great nephew. And I think today what I'm bringing to is, similar to the wonderful words of our co-host, Serena, is often a teaching as well that, where I come from, it's always looking back to look forward. What have we learned from our ancestors, and what's that legacy that, the hard work that they've put into preparing everybody for the world of work and school, so that we can continue to do what we need to do to carry on that work for the future 7 generations. And so I come to you today with those thoughts in mind, and I invite you to think about what you're going to hear today and to step into the power of your own humanity, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want prosperous and safe families and communities where Indigenous people can lead their own lives in ways that are right for them, the way that they've been taught, and that their traditions and everything matter and are valued. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you. So my name is Victoria Grant, and I'm Timiagama Anishinaabe. I belong to the Loon clan, and my home territories in Northern Ontario. And I bring to you on my slide a canoe, because for me, I ran a business called Moving Red Canoe, and a canoe is, first of all, Canada was built on canoes, and secondly, I truly believe a canoe carries a spiritual body, and it is something that if we all have to agree on where we're going, and we all have to agree to sit in a particular way. So there has to be agreement in order to move forward. And I think it's a really good metaphor for Canada and for moving forward. You will notice in the other picture is the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation, the 94 calls to action, and UNDRIP. And in the middle of all of that, written out, is a declaration of action that was put forward by the philanthropic community in Canada to do the best things they could. And that really was where my work had taken me for the last 20 years. And it is why I am chair of the Counseling Foundation, which is a sister organization to CERIC. And I do this all for those 4 kids in the pictures, which is my 4 grandchildren. And the last picture is a slide of Temagami. And again, what more do you have to say? The water's beautiful, and it is a lake in Northern Ontario that is clear and beautiful. So today we have questions, but we're actually not. We're going to have a discussion, and we're going to start by talking. Each one of them is going to give us a view or challenge the other one, I'm hoping, in some cases, to talk about the 1 or 2 historical events that have happened in your respective countries that have had an impact on Indigenous peoples in your country related to career development. We'll have that question, but I really want you to understand how it impacted your life and your work, what chose you, how you chose to get into this work. So I'm going to ask Lynette to start.
How I chose, I often think I didn't choose career development chose me, and I'm thankful for that. I think when I think back to first entering the field, I have images of my whānau working. So, the notion of work and what that looked like, what that felt like, what that sounded like. So that's quite a strong, it centers me in the work that I do today. So I came into the field with that as my platform, if you like. And over time, in the various roles that I've held in career development, it was quickly obvious that there were some people who held certain jobs and others that did different types of work. And there was a difference there, a difference in, the positions they held, the financial rewards they held. And I wondered more about that. How did that happen? How do people choose or select or decide or go into specific areas of work? And what is the notion of career as I move further into into this area now? So those kind of questions played a significant role in me continuing to find roles that eventually got me into academia, teaching, and research. So it was that kind of journey. I've got some very strong images which I used to use a lot in my teaching about what work means, what career means, and the whole concept of life career, which some of our colleagues, theorists, talk about. So yeah, that's briefly how I got it. I think the field chose me.
I'm just going to push you a little bit more.
Yep.
In your work, when did you start, or did you see a difference between the Indigenous people in New Zealand and what you were working with on a day-by-day basis?
Yeah, one of my very first roles in this field, I noticed immediately that there were differences, and I wondered why, what I could do about it. But the why was what prompted me to continue to find other roles to perhaps get closer to understanding why. And I guess then I went into a role where I was what we called here in New Zealand a vocational guidance counsellor, where I was working one-on-one with clients, with people. And so I could hear the stories, the pūrākau, their experiences, and particularly for Māori, their experiences of being Māori and what that looked like and how that felt in relation to employment or in relation to work. So I think that role was probably the most significant turning point for me. because I began to understand that there were diverse realities for Māori. And having come from a very small town, Gisborne, here in New Zealand, to Auckland, and to see the diversity of cultures, I had to learn that experience as well. So, yeah, it was definitely in my very first role. But once I went into the counselling position, I understood more of the experiences, how people feel about being Māori, how resistant they were to certain things, how passionate we were about particular things. So it was getting to really know people, rather than sort of putting people into categories, into jobs, into areas. It was that notion of really finding out who people were and how they were feeling about being Māori.
Peter, what about you? Oh, you can't hear you, Peter.
Just realizing I just went past my room, so I had to unmute it. Interesting. Yeah, I share the same with Lynette. My experience has been that careers has chosen me, but through my involvement in this particular field, you start to see the impacts of why there's the privilege from our colonial forebears. And then that started me investigating or exploring what that actually meant, because I had a unique lens. Though I am Indigenous, my upbringing is indigenously is from the Pacific or Samoa, but I've lived in New Zealand and I have viewed and experienced the impacts of racial institutions, the colonial impacts. Samoa and the rest of the Pacific do share colonial impacts, but from their own different lens, their own different experience as they have impacted. And the one thing that I did sort of notice when this question was posed was the language. When the language is taken away or it's not in the forefront, it starts to erode at that particular communities, and certain identities that are attached to the language then impacts. From a career perspective for Pacific Islanders here, there are sort of like the conversations I have with my Pacific community is more around their lived experience as migrants in Aotearoa. However, we do share the same traumas or the impacts from colonialism, but we don't necessarily focus on those, but more from how do we operate in getting our voices heard in our communities and then with the work that we do. I don't know the answer, because that was the one thing that I thought about was the language and identity being taken away. I mean, there are many different stories, and I'm sure there are similar examples in other Indigenous where language is taken away or you're not meant to speak your language, and that has impacted in some way. I hope that's answered the question.
Speak to that in a big way.
Yeah. I mean, and some of that is so layered, and it does impact your career path, because you're thinking about those sort of traumas as a Pacific person going into, when I have conversations with Pacific leaders, they are consciously thinking that they have to think the privilege that comes with no, I've got to rephrase that. That was about I heard. For Pacific people, we are always consciously aware of who we are, or when it's highlighted. We don't have the freedom of actually just being ourselves totally within a conversation or within an interview. You're consciously aware. me being Samoan, is that can I actually help me with my interview, or would that actually be deter by my opportunities? Yeah.
So, Trina, listening to Lynette and Peter,
Mhm.
I'm curious to know what you would have to say on this topic.
Yeah, well, I think for myself, it really comes down to, back in the late 90s, really witnessing a disconnect. And this disconnect that Indigenous people were starting to thrive. We were starting to see graduates come out of post-secondary for the first time in a very long time. But they weren't finding their place in the world of work. There was still barriers and challenges and ways of hiring and recruiting just weren't suiting culturally relevant ways. And so in terms of career, and you think back to, what Peter and Lynette were talking about as well, those historic colonial policies that were put in place, they were assimilation policies to keep Indigenous people out of mainstream, out of society by removing culture, removing them from employment, not permitting them to go to post-secondary education. It wasn't until the 1960s here in Canada that you had 4 Indigenous people going to university for the first time and breaking through those barriers. And now we think back to those trailblazers. And so when I think about career and development, I think about my mom and my aunties and my uncles who really, went against policies because they wanted better for their families. And so today I think it's about, learning from the past and learning from the challenges and the mistakes of the past. And how can we now be creative and find ways of, as we say, braiding together, bringing Indigenous ways of knowing and doing about the world of work, because let's face it, our communities around the world would not have survived if people in those communities did not have a role to play, if they weren't working in their communities, if they weren't caring for each other with medicines or, creating homes and having ways of governance. All of that is, to me, the world of work. So we've always worked, but I think it's just finding ways of bringing that historic traditional knowledge now back into these career conversations like we're having today. And so for me, that's sort of been the passion and drive, is always asking the question, well, why not? Why can't we do something a little bit differently? Because if we continue to do what we've always done, we'll continue to get what we've always gotten, and that's excluded. And so we want to be included now. So it's about sharing and talking and sharing perspectives. And I think career development has such a meaningful place now as Indigenous peoples and nation building, really. And so in the work I do, whether it's empowering practitioners to carry on career coaching in their own communities, or sometimes it's having to sit in boardrooms with recruiting officers of big companies and exploring how to do things differently so that they can help support career for their new talent. So those are just some of the thoughts today that come to mind.
One of the things when I listen to all of you, the question around, people are talking about colonization, you're talking about policies, and then you're talking about Indigenous worldview and cultural understanding. Can we tie those together? And whoever wants to speak first, can we tie those together? How do we tie those together? And do you tie them together in the work you're doing?
Victoria, when you were saying tying it together, were you tying in terms of
how do you interweave them in your work? How do you, there are policies, and sometimes policies can be exclusive, but we're trying to bring in our ways of knowing and doing into the practice. And I think it's a practice for everybody. So how do we do that so that I, as an Indigenous person, when I go in to meet with you, I feel like I'm a part because of what's in your policies. I feel like I belong there. So
yeah. Well, for me, I think it's around, I often use a metaphor, and I say it's like we're renovating a house together. There's certain things about this house, whether it's policies that we've all inherited in our different workplaces or history. There's certain things that we cannot change. We can't go back to change certain things. And in some organizations, you know, we have policies and frameworks and structures which are there, and they are a framework. However, now we can decide as a group working together in those conversations, whether it's with our clients or with our colleagues, about how do we want to renovate this together? What are the changes we want to make? And what are those different worldviews and perspectives about how we go about using those policies? And how can we adapt them to make them more inclusive? And whether that's, you know, for example, in some places, I come from a background where we have 7 teachings, 7 important values. And so we talk about how can we bring those values into the workplace conversation, because workplaces have values and we're attracted to the world of work, to a certain employment field, because there's a connection for us. We're drawn there because maybe there's a value or something we connect with in that industry or that work role. And how can I bring my Indigenous ways of knowing and doing into delivering that work? And so I think that's a little bit about how to weave it, and sometimes making the policies a little bit flexible.
Yeah, I think in my Indigenous mind or my ways of Samoan thinking, I tend to not think of policies. I go straight to what intuitively for me is spirituality and the connectedness of building safe spaces to have conversations. And I think they automatically fall into those policies where it is centric to the needs of a person in terms of those beautiful values that we share amongst all cultures. So I do see the policies, and I just know that from reading policies and the ways that how organizations might operate from a value-based organization, I know automatically as a Samoan, and maybe that's just me being unapologetic of my ways of seeing things, but there's a knowingness that my values that have been taught from my ancestors are always can resonate in any situation, even especially within having conversations that I may have with non-Pacific clients. There's a Māori word, koha, or gift. And so when I'm having conversations with non-Pacific or non-Māori, I'm always thinking about that element of conversation with a koha. There's always a gift that I'm giving and a gift that they will be giving to me. And that's where the reciprocity that comes in, that then takes me away from that legal jargon and policies around it, because I know fundamentally if those values are being followed through, we're able then to have an organic conversation that opens it from a real authentic place.
I agree with Peter.
Yeah. It's more of a spiritual approach to it. Yeah.
I think the notion of, well, the concept of policy does generate images of not always, often attending to Indigenous worldviews or Māori worldviews. And I, like Peter talked about going to spirituality, I went to practice. And I here I'm talking about career practice. So the career professional, how that person is in relation a Māori person. So I feel like there is more we can do and should be doing in that space, which will inform policy. Well, it should inform policy. So I was looking at it from that kind of perspective. If as a field, our practice is, can be different, can be, we can ensure there's inclusiveness for Māori and other cultures in Aotearoa, then that has to inform policy. So I guess I'm thinking about that practice space, and I really like the comment about doing things together. And Peter's picked up on that as well, conversations, talking together. But I wanted to add that there are times too when, as Māori, we need to talk amongst ourselves too, because we have a lot of experiences of colonization, a lot of experiences of careers, and some of them not all positive. So, what are we thinking about that? Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes there's a little, there's just another opportunity here for Māori to speak as Māori, with Māori, and then come together as a collective with others. So I just wanted to add that in there. It's yes, there's a togetherness, there's a connectedness, but I do feel that the process of colonization is so deep that there are things we're relearning, we're reclaiming, and sometimes we can only do that within a Māori space.
So do you have a story that you would share that would kind of demonstrate or illustrate your practice, your career practice, that would be that the audience could relate to in real life? Like, is there something that you have to share?
I think this is probably one of the few things that I'm proud about this nation of Aotearoa, in terms of weaving in tikanga, or ways of being for Māori. And when I have one-on-ones with my client, and it's become sort of like it's the normalization of Indigenous practices within meetings and within groups. So the simple act of a karakia, which is either a prayer or an incantation. It's Māori in its terms, but for Pacific, because spirituality is a really important part of the Pacific communities, be it through a Christian perspective, but underneath the element is the acknowledgement of spirituality. And so where I will always open up with a karakia with Pacific and Māori clients, but now it's becoming the norm, which is it's been normalized in a lot of government organizations. There's a lot to adopt to create the richness of where Aotearoa is, where New Zealand is at this present stage. But I suppose what I'm saying there is having a look, because I'm viewing it from a point as a Pacific career practitioner, and I'm wanting to speak to our non-Indigenous practitioners, is to really know thyself. Mm-hmm. It's really important that for you to enter into a conversation with of anyone of any culture, as well as Indigenous, is the sense of you knowing who you yourself are. So by knowing yourself, then when you enter the conversation with an individual who is of Indigenous or of a different culture, sort of like it then sort of opens up your mind to reflect around your own biases that you might have yourself, and then unpack what that actually looks like and means. And sometimes, and for me, it's common around my conversations with non-Pacific, is that when we unpack that together, it does get emotional, but it also is quite healing too as well, to share parts of that experience that one may have. And I normally talk about job interviews when I first started off, the fear of going in and knowing that I may not get that job because I'm Samoan, or I may not get that job because I live in a specific area that I will be judged on. I mean, that's the thoughts that were going through my head now. That's not in question. But I find that to be, when I am having conversations with my non-Pacific, is the element, and the term has just left my head, deficit theorizing, when you're going into a conversation and there's something to theorize the basis of, because there are this is what I need to bring, as opposed to just going in with a blank canvas and having an open conversation.
Trina, Lynette, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say, when I think back to working with different youth groups, it's about building that relationship. It's about being similar to what Peter's talking about. It's, as a practitioner, bringing your authentic self into that moment and really being present, I think, and empowering those clients or, my workshop participants, empowering them to unpack the knowledge that already exists within them. And we're there to help facilitate and let them see the gifts inside themselves. And sometimes it's, that's when the beautiful thing happens, because there's so much knowledge in our people already. They just haven't had the space or time to have it unpacked or to, share it. And so I think as a facilitator, sometimes the best thing we do is actually, and I say this about allyship as well, is knowing when to step aside and knowing when to let that Indigenous person, youth, adult client lead. When you see they sit up a little straighter, or they go, oh, can I talk about this? And you see that they have that wisdom is coming, and it just changes their whole persona. Because I think for so long, we've been shut down and shut away, that now as a practitioner, the best thing to do is to give them that space to come to their own realizations. And by being our authentic selves, I think it's also that relationship of, when I'm doing a session or a talk, it's similar to how we did this opening today. It's what is your story as a practitioner? Who are you behind the letters behind your name? I often say, because to connect to our people, we're story people. We want to know about your family, your struggles, your challenges, how you got to be where you're at, because at the end of the day, we want to connect as people. And when I connect with you as a person, as an individual, it builds up that trust. And then I'm willing to go on that learning path with you. So those are just, I think, a couple of things that I bring into my practice.
Very good.
What did you think about, Trina? Sorry, Lynette.
When I think about stories, the first stories that come to my mind aren't stories that I've heard as a practitioner. They're just stories you hear through whānau, through friends, about what people are doing. And when I think about the characteristics of those stories, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the wonderment. That it's like, wow, what the heck, that is unbelievable, that is amazing. So that's the first thing that strikes me. And the second thing is that I'm actually able to recognize that there's a lot of difference here. There's different behaviors and actions compared to, a more Western perspective of careers. So I picked that up quite quickly, and it makes the story even more amazing. And I am amazed at how often Māori just trust themselves to do it, trust themselves, back themselves. And I have to tell these stories now, those quick stories, of a whānau of our sons who had decided to develop their whenua or their land up north. It's way up north too, so it's very remote. And a lot of their whānau have lived in Australia. And so they're encouraging everyone to, slowly come back home. There's already a couple of whānau there, and they're working their whenua, they're working their own land, living in caravans on the whenua as well, with the main goal initially of bringing people home. They're not sure where this is going to go to. They have different, there's different opportunities that have come up in the community where they're able to run a small business. But that story, I'm like, wow, that's incredible. They're all learning te reo. It's just, to me, it's just amazing. And there's more and more of that happening. And then the other story at the other end of things is a large Māori incorporation in Nelson who have done a 500-year plan. I mean, for the generations. I mean, if that's not generational, if that's not intergenerational, I don't know what is. A 500-year plan to look at where they want to be, and how they're going to get there. So, I mean, those are kind of two stories that I've not been, I'm semi connected to one. But as I say, there's just the wonderment of that. There's the Māori backing themselves. We're going to do this. We can do this. And it's careers, but it's not. It's careers, but it's different. And I'm thinking, cool, love that.
So we're coming to the end of our discussion, but there are 3 questions I'm going to read out. And then I want each of you to decide which one you want to answer or speak to. One of the things is becoming the norm is different than understanding why this practice is becoming incorporated. People are incorporating Indigenous knowledge, acknowledgements, and traditions because they are told to, but there may be no understanding of why. Thoughts? That's the first one. The next one is, how do you further encourage youth, adult Indigenous candidates during interviews or the job applications process to have more confidence in seeing the gifts that they can bring to the job? And I like this one too. How specifically can the journey of reconciliation be positively impacted by international collaboration of Indigenous communities and the sharing of similar and diverse colonial experience of those Indigenous communities? Just light questions.
Well, to answer your last question, I think this is an example. This is an example of and I think that's the example of allyship, that people will need to support or create safe spaces or spaces where the voices of Indigenous are heard. For example, here, and it's I just remember the backstory is before we even started, we did point out the point how beautiful it was to be together, and though we are from different parts of the world, but our Indigenous stories resonate, because of our colonial past, but and also because of that collective perspective that we have on life, that it's not about us, it's about the whole community that we belong to. So yeah, I think I think the world globally are hankering for that wisdom, and I go back, and I will always be harping on about the Indigenous viewpoint around spirituality and the Indigenous ancient wisdoms that we could learn, not only within careers, but within life in general. Yeah. I think when you tap into those knowledges, you also have answers that can help the modern issues that we've arisen because of those, the displacement of our Indigenous knowledge. That was a sweeping sort of line. I took the first question because I thought I could not.
You took the first question and the last one.
You answered all of them, Peter.
But I suppose with youth, I came up with this concept. If you can imagine a triangle with a little circle at the top and then two circles underneath, and then another couple of circles underneath, and that builds a pyramid. And I use this with the youth, Pacific youth, and with Māori youth, because whakapapa or ngafa, your genealogy is a really important part of who you are. And so I would put them at the middle at the top, and then underneath that I'll ask who's your parents or your caregivers, and then I'll ask who those caregivers, who are their parents, and then I'll ask who are those other people within your families that you admire or that you look to as role models. And so they fill out that circle. And then the talanua. So the talanua is a concept that Violeti talked about in terms of the open conversations, the conversations that are wide and have no meaning, but will formulate, organically appear. So I'll ask questions to this. So tell me a little bit about this particular person that you admire within your family. And so they'll come up with traits. What do they do for a living? Oh, da, 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 da. Then I'll ask them, what does your mum and dad do? So tell me a bit about what are things about mum and dad that you enjoy and like? And so we then sort of like list, and then we go through, what are those values like? And do you hold those values? Yes, I do. Where do you think that way of being could be seen in a dream of a job that you may have? Right? So that's an Indigenous way, and I think it's Indigenous, but it's global. When you start to talk about family and the importance of family, because family, faith, and culture are three fundamental important things within Pacific families. And I'm consciously aware that I do not talk from a wide perspective. I'm Samoan-centric as a Pacific, because the Pacific is split into different areas. You've got your Melanesian, your Polynesian, your Micronesian, but the common denominator under all that is family, faith, and culture. So when you are going into a conversation, you may want to look at those areas of open up questions to say, well, who's important in your family, or who's a role model in your family? And then it becomes a true and authentic story if we're talking with youth. Yeah. And if not, then it's probably then it would be forgotten the name of the theorist around the life book, where you start to ask questions to construct a narrative. Do you have asked the two questions?
There. Well, I thank you, Peter, for that, because as you were talking, it made me think about the first question about people trying to understand, why we're in this time of Indigenous acknowledgement and traditions, and I think when I reflect back on it, because we have seen, that change in workplaces and in organizations. And I think because everybody from different families, cultures, backgrounds, wherever you come from, part of your own individual story is we always try to find what is our place in space, in context to where we are. Whether we've immigrated from a different country or we've grown up somewhere. And I think, just speaking from my own perspective as a First Nations person here in Canada, when I hear organizations want to, do traditional acknowledgements and such, and people do ask this question, why are we doing it? I think it's because it's important, because it's a part of the story of the country within that you're living in now. And Indigenous people's story in whichever country you're in is an important part of the story that needs to be acknowledged and honored. And for some folks, I think then once you understand that history and you learn to unpack it a little bit as a citizen within that country, you then have the opportunity to reflect on, how does your story now connect with what you've just learned? And for some folks, it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable for a little bit, as we're learning new things, as we're giving that space and voice to Indigenous peoples within their countries to tell their story about their history, about the lands upon which we all live and work today, and honoring that, I think, is important. And so I think that, I don't know if that addresses the question, but that's just the perspective of it. I think it's a part of the story that needs to unfold, and we just need to start getting comfortable with it and creating more of these spaces for Indigenous people to tell the stories and to share that. So
just a quick question, Victoria and Trina. I think I always like to address the white elephant in the room, and really it is about unpacking your biases.
Mm-hmm.
And if we really fundamentally go down to why are we all here, it's then what does it trigger in you as a practitioner, whether you're Indigenous or not. It does trigger something there around comfortability, or how uncomfortable it may be, and addressing those. I'm thinking of the book around it's just lost me. I'll remember it. White Fragility. Dr. Robin Margie, I think her name is. Fantastic book to address biases. If you're unpacking all that too as well and willing to learn.
I love the presentation you made on the first question, Trina. That was wonderful. Yes, because the Indigenous knowledge and stories are part of the country that we are all currently in. And I mean, when there's a question like why, there's always the, well, why not? Why not understand and learn and, find out, read, listen to the narratives as well. And I think that perhaps has some link with what you've just said, Peter, about, biases that exist, the notion of power and power relations as well being touched on, that is creating that question, why? So, yeah, I love the way both of you have presented that first question. The second question around youth. Again, I love what you said, Peter. Start with something that youth, people, clients feel confident in. So that you can get that sense of what it feels like to speak from a position of confidence when you go into an interview. So find something that they know, they feel good about, they're confident about, and start from there in order to move into what the next step is. And I totally agree too about that third question. We've started a relationship, an international collaboration that I'm sure we can, we will continue. Well, we'll certainly continue next week. But, we represent, CERIC and CDANS represent a very good example of ways to respond to question number 3.
I have one other question I'm going to read out, and I think we're coming to the end of our thing, but declaring Aboriginality or Indigenous identity for applications for employment or job seeking tends to be upfront in the initial stages. I've had students who hesitate with this and want to be seen on personal merits first. What is your advice to those students regarding when and where or how this impacts both their approach and the organization to which they are applying?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think we've been talking about it being client-centric. There's always lead with the decision of the individual that you're having a conversation with. Around, if they don't, then they don't. I'm just going to be blunt. What it will do is that you just unpack it. If it does concern you, then unpack that conversation first about then why are you thinking it will be uncomfortable for that particular student, or students don't want to. I normally will. I can see it, but I haven't had experience of it. maybe it's because the students that I deal with are unapologetic about their identity. They tick that box, and I clearly understand because we've created safe spaces to shine. But the question that's been brought, maybe the environment or the location that they live in has defined that question to come through. But I would open the conversation, unpack it more with that particular student as to why. To me, it's not necessarily the ticking of the box. For me, it's highlighting whether you want to celebrate their greatness anyway, regardless. And then say, well, if you can see that box as a place of identifying who you are in terms of the greatness of your community, then pick it. But if you think it causes a trauma or causes some sort of anxiety, then I personally wouldn't push it, but I will open up the conversation.
Yeah, building off of that, Peter, I think in some examples in the work I do with corporations, because they often are trying to have these Indigenous inclusion strategies, and they'll say, but people aren't coming forward self-identifying and such. And so on the other hand, I think too, for the individual, it comes down to trust. It comes down to that relationship again between myself as an individual and how I choose to show up in the world of work, how I choose to acknowledge my culture and my background, and that bringing that story into the world of work. And on the side of the organizations who, whether it's, a scholarship or an employment opportunity or something like that, I think it also comes down to that trust with the organization of how does declaring that benefit that individual versus a benefit for the company and the organization, because it comes down to that relationship, and we've seen, we've talked about it here today that, our countries have been through 100+ years of relationships being broken, and it's going to take many years for those relationships to be repaired. So even simple questions like that on a application form, I think companies and organizations who ask those questions really need to understand, why are you asking it? Because you're asking that person to be vulnerable with you and to share that. And how are you going to support them when they do declare? What are the career advances, the career opportunities, the safety in the workplace should that person want to declare sooner or later? So for myself, it comes back to relationship and building that trust as an employer, as an education institution with that individual. Because they're, we want people to succeed. We want them to be able to be their authentic selves. So organizations need to play their role in creating those safe spaces, I think, as well. So that's some thoughts on that question, Victoria.
Thank you. Lynette, did you want to say something?
I totally agree with Peter and Trina. My thoughts were that whether you're ticking a box or noting personal merits, either way, you're still expressing being Māori. You have a Māori self, so that that's coming out anyway.
That's a great line. I like that. So I think we've come to the end of our questions and our time. I want to thank you, Lynette and Peter and Trina. It has been wonderful to have you. And we will be back, I think, next week. But I think Cyril is coming back on to do her thing.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Trina, Lynette, and Peter. It has been such a wonderful first session. I cannot believe that it's already gone. It went so fast. Peter, you said earlier that when you engage with non-Pacific people, you feel that you are giving them a gift of sharing your value and spirituality. I just felt that tonight you all gave us a gift, or tonight or this morning, sorry, today, I shall say, you all give us a gift to be able to witness those conversation and reflection. I also like, Trina, how you used the metaphor of the house and how we can work together at renovating the house together, which actually is a good transition for next week, right? Where we will discuss allyship. So again, really thank you, Lynette, Trina, Peter, for having been with us today. I will encourage all our participants to reflect on the conversation we had today, building relationship, cultural sharing, resilience. We talk about a lot of very interesting points. And I will invite you all to continue this dialogue and join us next week for our second webinar, where we'll delve into the topic of nurturing authentic relationship with Indigenous community. And I'm happy to say that we have extended the second session by 15 minutes to allow for more dialogue and questions. So if your schedule doesn't permit you to stay that long, rest assured that you will share the recording within the next 24 hours. With all that said, I hope to see you all for the second webinar on Monday, September 25 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, on Tuesday, September 26 at 9 a.m. in New Zealand. And we'll continue learning and relearning together. Until then, take care and see you all next week.
Thank you very much.